Jessamyn West is a librarian and community technologist. She writes a column for Computers and Library magazine and is the author of the book Without a Net, Librarians for Community Advocacy. For the University of Hawaii's Library School, she was research fellow at Harvard University Library Innovation Lab for 2016 and 17 and serves on the advisory board to the Wikimedia Foundation. She works with small libraries and businesses in central Vermont to help them use technology to solve problems. Let's give a big welcome for Jessamyn West.
I'm going to talk about a bunch of different things, and I figure with most talks people walk out the door with like one or two things that they're like, oh, I'd really like to know more about that one thing. The web address up here, librarian.net/talks/tech forum, is the slides. It's URLs to other stuff if you want to read more about stuff, because librarian. And it's also got slides you can use yourself. All the pictures I'm using are Creative Commons licensed. You can basically take whatever you want and use it yourself if you want to. So getting started, I love coming to Canada because people are friendly, and I get to go to big cities where technology seems more like a cool thing you could do something with and useful, and less like a hostile invader intent on undermining your way of life. For people who don't know me, I'm from central Vermont. I'm from a town of 4,500 people, and I spend a lot of my actual work time when I'm not doing stuff like this sort of getting people signed up for their first email account and teaching them, you know, basic sort of the difference between click, double click, and right click, and then we practice. So I'm here to talk to you about digital divide in general, and I'm basically here to do kind of three general things. Talk about some characteristics of digitally divided people in 2018 and introduce the idea of digital readiness. As an example, this dude up here, this is him pulling fiber through the hills by my house 3 years ago. This isn't like old-timey, like, ooh, rural electrification. This is my life right now. This guy is my neighbor. And if you want to know more about the guy, there's links on the page of links. Fascinating, fascinating story. I want to introduce you to the work and tactics of Phil Agri, who's the guy up in the corner, who's a sort of was a technology educator and instructor for a long time, and he talks a lot about sort of tech philosophy, used to when he was sort of a working professor, and I think most of what he has to say is super interesting and useful, and then just open a conversation about the ways librarians are uniquely positioned to try and make this situation better, maybe, and which can also be a framework to how to think about some of the other ideas and issues you may sort of come up against at this and other conferences where we talk about a lot of big ideas, but then we have to go home and try and figure out how to make them work with actual people. So if I was doing this talk in 45 seconds instead of 45 minutes, I'd be like, hey, the digital divide's important because technology is important for personal and professional reasons, especially as the world is changing and digitally divided people get left behind, basically. And number two, the people who are building a lot of the technology we use are sometimes, often, making bad choices because of the digital divide, and as a result, they don't see the people who I see because they don't live where I live. People look at me sometimes a little bit and they're like, Jessamyn, you're really good with computers. Why do you live in a tiny town and teach technology when you could make so much more money being in a big city? And I'm like, the fact that you answered that question is the reason I have to live in this tiny town, because people just presume that like maybe everybody who isn't optimizing their financial potential is in some way stupid, and they build software as if that were the case. So moving on. So these people don't necessarily do that stuff on purpose. A lot of times it's just by accident. A lot of times it doesn't occur to them that there may be people for whom email is not only not a dead technology, but a new technology. Or the paperless office was always a great idea and never actually worked for the way a lot of us have to do our jobs, even though it could and it might and et cetera. But realistically, real world, we sort of need to talk about this. And then I'd also say, read Phil Agri's How to Help Someone Use a Computer. It was written in 1996. I'm going to use some quotes from it during this talk. Most of it's still true today. And it's a lot of good advice because it's not a lot of sort of hold the mouse like this, but more like think about the world like this, which is useful for people like us who are usually an intermediary with people who are learning versus people who are building, and we may be building stuff ourselves and also learning stuff ourselves. So it's sort of hard to show the digital divide. People just give you a lot of pictures of bridges and are like, it's kind of like this. And that's actually part of the larger problem. Librarians tend to understand the issue because we see digitally divided people in our populations, whether it's small town libraries like mine or at Toronto Public, every single day. But they can be a little bit invisible to the people who create the technology that digitally divided people have to use. So part of the divide is the lack of overlap between tech-rich society and tech-poor society. And some of this can be just literally proximity. Vermont is not near San Francisco kind of thing. But part of it can be demographic. It can be age-based, class-based, race-based, gender-based. 20-something white men in cities are building a lot of the technology that everyone else is using. And I know that that's not completely true, and it's always exciting for me to see more women coding more stuff, et cetera. But it's still not enough to sort of change the fact that that sentence is more or less true. So I've taken to just telling stories about the people that I work with. This is Janet. These are from my Twitter. You can click through and read about them if you want to. Every Tuesday I do a drop-in time. I sit in a room. People come in with their questions. It's free to them. We answer whatever their questions are. This week I was there for 2.5 hours. We had 11 people with their random questions. And then I write them all up on Twitter, and everybody's like, I had no idea people like this existed. And I'm like, well, it's just me doing my job. And so these stories are every day for me. But they play big on Twitter where the tech people are. And I like to think this is helping. So I met Janet through drop-in time, and it's through a tech high school. Do you guys have like tech education? So it's like 11th and 12th grade for kids who are more sort of trade-based and less sort of college prep. So they learn like diesel engine mechanics and natural resource management, and they build houses. It's actually pretty cool. And so I've been doing this for 10 years, I guess. Janet is a square dancer who maintains a spreadsheet of the people who come to the square dancing camping trip that she puts together. It's amazing. It's so interesting. I learned so much from Janet. But someone in her church was using WordPerfect and sending these documents that Janet can't open, and Janet doesn't know that that's because Janet doesn't have WordPerfect, because why would she know? Because who still uses WordPerfect? The lady from Janet's church. So it's real for Janet. And so I showed her how to do open with from within Microsoft Word. So you double click on the file and nothing happens. The computer's just like, I don't care. But if you go inside of Microsoft Word and click open with, or you right click, but right clicking is a little tricky, suddenly, presto, your computer does the things the television tells you it's supposed to. So we'll start here. This is a fact, more or less. I think in the PR material for this thing, it said 15%. And I'm here to tell you the good news. It's more like 13. But really, basically, I've been doing talks like this for a good chunk of time, and this number hasn't budged. It started at 20-ish, and it's at 13-ish, and it is not budging from 13-ish, which is surprising to me, but true nonetheless. And in Canada, this is the United States number, but in Canada the number is almost exactly the same, which is fascinating to me because theoretically in Canada there are more people in broadband-capable areas, as I understand it, and I'm certainly not here to explain Canada to Canadians, for hand-wavy reasons because you have a government and we have whatever we have. And then, I just want to talk about what it really means to be offline, these 13%. What's their deal? What's the outline of the digital divide? And so the digital divide sounds like a really easy idea, but it's a little bit complex because it kind of used to be a thing. Computers are too expensive, you don't have money, you can't afford a computer, ergo, you're divided, the end. And libraries and everybody else were like, hey, money's actually a thing we can do something with. And so now, 97% of the population in the US, I'm sure you guys have similar numbers, I just don't know what they are, have 97% of our population in the US has a public library with a free computer plus internet that somebody can go to use. So that's awesome. This thing, we mostly helped deal with. I'm not saying it's perfect, right? I'm just saying mostly you can't just say, well, digital divide, it's just kind of a money thing. It's basically ameliorated and it has remedies that work. Secondly, there's the thing that I like to call the usability divide, but I don't call it the usability divide. I call it the where are those damn triangles that are hiding all of my things divide. because I teach a lot of Facebook classes, and everybody reads about Facebook in the paper, and then they're like, okay, I want to go change my stuff, and I have to show them essentially a 6 by 8 pixel area on a 2,000 pixel screen and be like, when you can click that, you get to change your privacy settings. That's a pain in the ass, right? Like, that's frustrating to them, and the message they walk away from is Facebook doesn't actually care about me being able to fix my privacy settings, which, while true, isn't the message Facebook would be telling you it was trying to send you. They just know it's difficult, and et cetera. And this is another sort of issue. We also have a thing that we have in America called healthcare and health insurance, which is the worst, let me tell you. But we had healthcare.gov, which was during the Obama administration. Hey, you can get healthcare, but you need to go through basically a website to get it. And it turned out the website wasn't very good. And I knew it wasn't very good because I know what a good website looks like. For a lot of people who had to get online and they'd only ever used whatever, like Facebook and their Yahoo email, and suddenly they're confronted with this website, and that's where they have to go to get health insurance. It was very maddening, very frustrating. A lot of people walked away from that experience thinking, I guess computers are hard, because they don't know the difference between them being bad at using a website and that website being bad. That level of sort of discretion is an important part of kind of what we can bring to the table. And it's sad on so many levels because it's avoidable, right? That could have been an amazing website that at the end of it, you click through it and maybe it took a while, but then there's some like happy panda going like, way to go, you can get a checkup. And instead you just got a whole bunch of fail, fail, die, 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 which is how people felt, the government felt about them, which is bad. So basically, a lot of times people who are having what they perceive as trouble with computers are actually having trouble with interfaces, only they don't know what an interface is, and so they don't know that that is the problem that they are having. And so we can help with this, we librarians, but also kind of tech-forward tech people and anybody else who wants to be on board, with advocacy and our own good practices, building our own good, usable, tested websites. I worked for Wikipedia briefly on the One Lib, One Ref program at the beginning of this year, like, woo, add citations to Wikipedia. And we wrote it all up for the Wikipedia blog, and you know them. They're all like, oh, so open. Everything is open. It's all free. It's amazing. But the code that runs their blog doesn't include alt text for print-disabled people to be able to know what the pictures are because they didn't get around to building that with their open source crew of trusty volunteers. So on the one hand, I agree that they are amazing in a lot of ways. On the other hand, if we leave things like accessibility up to somebody being able to get around to it, I don't think that's a good look for us, being like, well, we never got a volunteer, so sorry, print disabled. So demanding stuff like that from our own vendors, simple stuff like alt text, simple stuff like secure login, simple stuff like please don't store the password in plain text in the database because it's embarrassing in 2018, Polaris, would be really a good idea for us, and advocacy is a thing we can do because we're upbeat, right? I don't have to holler at people. I'm just saying it'd be nice if. One of the things, it's not in this talk, but is in a different talk that I do, is talk about working on my vocabulary. So I used to spend a lot of time as a hothead just out of library school talking about how everything sucks, which many things do, but I find that when I move from the short sort of word sucks to the longer, smarter sounding word suboptimal, people are more interested and maybe more able to sort of get on board. And so then there's the last part of the divide, what I call the empowerment divide. Offline people, so people who are just basically not using the internet, look at these ads with these grinning white people all ignoring each other, wrapped up in their own devices, and they say, I don't want that. Why would somebody think I want that? And they feel more secure in their own decision to not engage because they see this as a place that they didn't want or they wouldn't want. And so a lot of people who aren't fully online have what I would consider concerns. So I used to moderate a giant internet community called Metafilter. Anybody in the room heard of it? Hey, I suspected. And I basically kept internet people from fighting with each other. And it was a place where a lot of people interacted online. And one of the things I found about heavy online users, like people who really hang out in the forums a lot, is a lot of times they have a reason. Whatever that reason is, right? They're online for a reason. Maybe they have a disabled family member they're caring for. Maybe they are that disabled family member. Maybe they're time shifted. You know, they work sort of for another country and they're up at night when other people are sleeping. Maybe they're agoraphobic and they don't like leaving the house. Maybe they're an expat. Maybe they have a weird hobby. Maybe they have a kink and they live in a small town and it's really hard to find people to relate to. Whatever the thing is, doesn't matter, but understanding their lives can help you understand how to work with them when they're struggling. And I think the same is true for offline people. A lot of times people are anxious, people are worried, especially about money. They don't understand the risks, they just know that there are some. Other sort of dying media likes to tell scary stories about new media to sort of keep their brand intact. I mean, we've got a weekly paper in my town, and I get to open it up and read about my neighbors, and it's amazing. But they're not super pro-forward about the internet, and that's not super surprising. They exist in slightly different areas. And so thinking about offline people, they might have physical challenges, they might also have mental challenges, they might have lack of energy for learning a new thing, because a lot of this stuff can be challenging and often very frustrating. And they're looking for, you know, a welcome mat, a happy panda or something, and a little bit less of a, hey, have you tried Ubuntu for that answer? And the reason I mention, hey, have you tried Ubuntu for that, not that there's anything wrong with Ubuntu, in fact, it's amazing, but that's what somebody told me I should tell Janet, and I thought maybe, you know, I say that for a laugh, right? But Janet's sort of trying to figure out something on her Windows computer, and, you know, well-meaning gentleman whose name I've removed just because, you know, this is normal for the internet. He's not being super weird. Was like, hey, you know, why Windows? And he's not wrong, but we also kind of say he's not even wrong, you know, because he's got the right solution, but for the wrong problem, which is not unusual in the tech world. But we, as sort of librarians or library-adjacent people, can be compassionate towards this gentleman. I see your point, sir. While also still not installing Ubuntu on Janet's laptop, unless her problem to solve is, you know, I've got too much free time and a desire to learn a new operating system in my 80s, in which case, go Janet. And so empowerment can also be inclusion or equity, depending on how you feel about these. I teach a class on community engagement. We argue a little bit about inclusion and equity as topics. But they're different aspects of a similar issue. Often people who are computer people, to use Phil Agree's parlance, are looking for a scalable solution, right? We hear it over and over and over again. And sometimes they can oversimplify the complexities of humanity into something that you can fit into a database or a checkbox. So letting people free-form fill in a gender field, let's just say, is preferable from a human standpoint, where people may have many different things to write in that box, especially depending on why you're asking. But from a database standpoint, it's a mess. And from a market research standpoint, where you have a client who's telling you, we need to split up the sales numbers by gender, you're not deputized to be the one who explains gender fluidity to them, you sometimes can be stuck. But how do you explain that same thing to the digitally divided transgender kid who is faced with this choice? And that kid may feel 1% or maybe 25% less likely to want to engage online because they don't feel included, they don't feel like it's in it for them. So I talk a lot, you could probably tell, about social justice issues and inequality issues. And I try to be tactical as well as truthful. And so one of the messages that I try to get across is the idea that a lot of institutionalized issues that are kind of entrenched, right? The digital divide isn't fixed by giving everybody a computer, as much as that would be awesome. Institutionalized issues like poverty, racism, ableism, ageism, homophobia, transphobia, that kind of thing. They hurt everybody, not just, of course, the people who are the targets or the victims of prejudice or intolerance. So from a personal perspective, I talk about this in terms of feminism, right? I'm female, this is what works for me. it can make a pragmatic sense to talk about it to a wider audience when feminism isn't just a thing for women, but a thing for anybody who kind of wants to be on board, because the idea of the patriarchy, the idea of normative gender stereotypes, the idea of toxic masculinity, or people just pressured to fit into a gender role, that's just bad for everybody, right? Like it's hard to feel constrained no matter where you come from or where you're going. And so talking about sort of feminism as something that works for that, I find has utility and can maybe help make it become a genuine option for somebody who maybe didn't think it was for them. So my message about the digital divide is it hurts everyone, and working on it helps everyone. And so sometimes people talk about the digital divide starting from rural electrification, the path we took to get citizens hooked up to the electrical grid, and rural electrification incentive programs, which you had in Canada and we have in the United States. So Horseshoe Falls was making power for Calgary in 1912. Actually, I think that's, well, it's underneath. You can imagine what it looks like. Rural electrification was completed in Ontario in about the early 50s, not as much in the other provinces. So 87% of rural Alberta, for example, had access to electricity by 1961. So, we're looking at a 10-year gap, and that's just access, which I'll get to in a second. There's another 13% who were still divided, very similar number, right, to what we're seeing now. So part of the answer to why are people still offline is they got a late start. Some other reasons we forget or might not know that part of the process of rural electrification was selling people the idea of electricity. Like, you need this. This is going to fix your life. This is going to improve things. And, getting electricity and an electric bill, electric stuff, electric companies would do little displays like, hey, check this all out. You can use a mixer. You can, your drudgery is nearly over, basically. They weren't just saying, hey, this is available in case you're interested. They were actively saying, this will help you. Get it. Try it. It's for everyone. And if it really is for everyone, that's actually kind of an inclusion empowerment move, which is awesome. But if not true, it makes offline people or people not attached to the grid at that point even less likely to trust whatever you say next. So electricity, this guy with the lightning eyebrows, was advertised, promoted, pushed. And this is why when they talk about rural electrification in Canada, you see sentences like 87% of rural Alberta had access to electricity, meaning we're ready to come to your house, but you got to say thumbs up, which is sort of true what we have now. So having access to it wasn't the same thing as using it. And it's interesting for me because like the last person to get an actual electric wire attached to their actual house who wanted one in Vermont was 1962. So pretty similar, and that's recent memory for a lot of my librarian, or living memory for a lot of my librarian cohort, in a town called Victory. And that's still true with broadband and the digital divide, only we don't have a government mandate. A little different here, but not entirely different here. And a different sort of advertising. It's mostly internet service providers advertising as they try to undermine net neutrality. That's a different message than just this is going to solve a problem for you. We're going to eliminate your drudgery. What people see instead is we're going to let predators come directly to your home instead of you having to meet them in the mall like the olden days. And that people are like, I don't understand why this solves a problem for me. And so I think of it a little bit like driving. Driving's a thing you can do. Driving's a thing probably most people do. Some people can't drive for various reasons, and there's workarounds for them, public transportation, et cetera. Some people just make a decision, like, I'm not really on board, I don't have a reason, I just don't want to. And those same workarounds will work for them also. But nearly everyone who makes a choice to be a non-driver understands the social costs of not driving. So again, I live in Vermont, aging population. There's a nice old man who lived in my town, Chris. Chris, moved up here from New York back when the train could take you up to Vermont for the weekend, and one weekend he just never went home. Never got a car, because you never have one in New York, so who cares? And he has like a team of like older women who drive him around because he's delightful. But everybody knows like he exists basically because of the kindness of older women who enjoy driving him around. And if Chris were less charming, Chris would get fewer rides to the store, right? Everybody understands sort of the parlay there. And it's not the same often, I find, for people not using computers. The costs of remaining offline are often hidden, or at least they are right up until your town floods, and the only remaining way to interact with the government's management agency is through a website. I kind of love this. This is FEMA, our Federal Emergency Management Agency. We have 2 ways to apply, online and also online. But it's your phone, so like it's different, right? And we did have like a big flood when Hurricane Irene came through Vermont, and there were people who literally the only way they could connect to our emergency management agency was through Facebook, because the Federal Emergency Management Agency's computers were in the ground floor of a building that was in a floodplain, and I don't know how they got those jobs, but so they, they worked it out. They got on Facebook and started communicating with people, but man, you were a happier person if you were already on Facebook before your house flooded than if you had to both figure out Facebook and apply for disaster relief after your house flooded in the dark, right? It's crappy, right? And so we see this in the library because we see a lot of people who show up at the library saying, I have an urgent need because something terrible happened to me. I lost my job, somebody died, I need health insurance, help me figure out the mouse thing. And, that is challenging. So in the US, you can get a social worker to help you apply for food stamps, which is good, but you can't get a social worker to help you fill out an online dating application. And when you think about what's more important to your well-being, those may both be actually fairly similar just in terms of what you need to be human, right? You need companionship, you need a place to live, you need food, you need cat videos. I don't know what you personally need, but it's important that we just don't do people's information needs in the library. We also do people's information desires. And so people's lack of connectivity, whether it's a choice or not a choice, can be isolating for them. And so realistically, I assume everyone in this room, you view a computer as a tool, right? Digitally divided users view computers as obstacles. And let's look at what else we know about sort of this 13%, the non-adopters. And some of these statistics are old because as the digital divide has shrunk, we are counting digitally divided people less because it's hit some threshold of and a rounding error. But that's hard when you fall in that rounding error because things are still important to you. So like I said, these are slightly older numbers, but the ratios are about the same even as the bars get taller. So in 2011, which I know is a long time in internet years, but 2011, people with disabilities were 27% less likely to use the internet, 28% less likely to have broadband at home. Even though the internet is accessible in many ways to people with disabilities. Same thing with people who prefer to speak Spanish at home, similar gaps, even though there is an entire internet in Spanish as well as in English. This should not be the case except that it is the case. So when we look at the numbers, and like I said, fewer people are counting these numbers because they kind of don't like the story. It's awkward, right? We gave them all computers. Why don't they have the thing? We realize the people who are getting left behind are the people with all the other challenges, the economic challenges, the education challenges, maybe they have mental health challenges, maybe they have physical health challenges. And if we know that, isn't that our responsibility to make sure they can have, the world of cat videos and food stamps, or food stamps and cat videos as well? So the hardest to serve have always been the hardest to serve, but they're society's responsibility. This is a thing that's less of a thing you have to sell in Canada, but in America, you're just no, seriously, they're everybody's responsibility. And when you look at what they need, this is a different survey. Pew looks at offline populations and asks them what they would need to get online. And so there's I don't know what I would need. I don't really want to start using the internet. 17% could go online on their own, which I thought was pretty interesting, but literally choose not to. But then 63%, I would need someone to help me. And who would that person be, right? Because another thing we know about institutionalized racism and institutionalized poverty, et cetera, is it's not just you don't have 20 bucks so you're poor. It's that everybody in your cultural area is themselves also grappling with poverty or multiple things. So you don't necessarily just have a neighborhood kid who, when they come home from college, can help you with the thing because they're struggling in the exact same way. So as the digital divide has been shrinking, this piece of the pie, I would need help, gets bigger. And we library people are the people who are the helpers. So when I was in library school, my favorite thing was helping people learn computers, right? And this was in the 90s. I lived in Seattle, which was kind of a hotbed of technology stuff, back when portals were a big thing. Not like Portal the video game, but we're going to do a portal so you can buy things from 3 different stores on one web page. And I help people get email accounts using like Rocket Mail and like Mail Excite. And I figured I would do that for a few years, and then everyone would have email, and then we could deal with more sophisticated topics, like online privacy, for instance, which is still a thing, or what to do when Equifax gets hacked and loses the data of most of the grown-ups in your country. And I kind of laugh at how naive that was of me at the time, like, oh, right, back when everybody was going to get email in a few years. It's 2018, I still sign people up for email accounts all the time, usually because they need it to do another thing, like apply for a job, dating site, who even knows what the thing is, FEMA website, apply for disaster relief. And so people move at their own pace, and you can only try and make their online experience good, so they might want to have another one. Because this is what we can work on, right? Your primary goal is to help them get one more step down the road to being deputized to solve their own problems, not to be the person, obviously, who, oh, my computer's got a problem, Jessamyn, blah, 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 blah. I mean, every time I tell my landlady, who's 93, she's got one eye, but she does all her own email. When I tell her I'm leaving town, that's when she's like, oh, hey, my email's been broken for like 6 days. Can you? And I'm like, how's it been broken for 6 days? Like 6 minutes, my email's broken, and I'm just like, losing my mind going to the library. But like, she doesn't use it that often. It's not that big a deal to her. But me not being there makes it occur to her that it is a thing she needs and would like to have access to, but she doesn't necessarily know a lot of people to help her fix it. And she's not digitally divided. Like, she's kind of a wealthy older lady, but she's a little crabby, and the people at the library are a little sick of her, and so she'd like to deal with me first. It's a phenomenon I like to call, like, the light is better over here. Like, why are you looking for your keys over here when you lost them over there? Well, the light's better over here. People go where they're comfortable and familiar. Good news, bad news, but it's bad news for my landlady when I'm not the person who can sort of help her with her thing. So other things, these just some quick examples of other kind of problem things people deal with. None of these are going to be totally novel to you, but I do like to kind of run down them. Helping people learn to use a computer all the time. Digitally divided people have trouble with things like shopping. They have a tendency to pay more because they buy local, which is fine. In fact, it's great for a number of reasons, but if you need like toner, I can make a good argument that you should save 20 bucks buying toner on the internet and just buying more socks from your local department store. Buying local is great, but you spend more money and you can't buy things like airline tickets local. Used to be back in the day, etc. You can't comparison shop local. Comparison shopping is useful. You're more at risk buying stuff locally in Vermont because getting in your car is more dangerous than getting on Amazon, ethical issues notwithstanding. Right? This is one of the things I tell people who are worried about identity theft and using online banking, is that online banking is safer than your shower. I mean, it's weird to think about, but it really is, except for the Equifax problem. But in a general personal, how is this gonna affect me, safer, et cetera, and fewer choices. Job applications, even for offline jobs, are often online or at least require a resume to upload. Uploading, confusing. Digitally divided people. The difference between uploading and downloading, completely mysterious. The cloud, who even knows what the cloud is, right? I'm just like, no, it's somebody else's computer. Well, whose computer? Well, Google's computer. Well, where is it? Finland? Why? Because electricity is cheap there. Why? Because they have fewer environmental regulations in these other countries. Why? Forget it. Let's just get your resume. We have a lot of people who used to be loggers or carpenters trying to get a job at Home Depot, and what Home Depot requires is that you upload your resume even if you're going to be working with lumber. So you can see these people in your libraries all the time. Getting them up for it is an important part of what we do. Meeting people, dating people has moved online in a lot of ways. Not really true for where I live, but in general it's true for larger places. And if you're primarily an offline person, it's possible you might be looking for an offline person. Nothing wrong with that, but a lot of social opportunities and networking opportunities happen in Facebook events and Eventbrite meetups and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. it's important when we talk about these online engagement opportunities to use language that explains that not only is this kind of stuff happening, it's kind of normative now. And it's fine if it's not your thing, but other people aren't weird because they meet somebody on the internet anymore. And maybe they never were, actually. So setting expectations is a useful part of it. And civics. I'm also an elected justice of the peace in my town, which is super fun. I get to marry people and count votes on election day. And that's how I know a third of my neighbors voted for Donald Trump. And we're like, what do we do about this? It's crazy. But it is. I had to apologize to my cab driver on my way to the hotel for everything that's happened in America basically since last November, and I would also like to apologize to everybody in this room. I worked really hard and it wasn't hard enough, and I'm sorry. So when I talk to librarians in Maine, for example, they talk about one of the things that gets digitally divided, like older men, especially in their communities, motivated, is the only way you can get a moose license, that's right, a license to shoot a moose, is by getting on the internet. I saw my first moose in Edmonton, Alberta, by the way, in 1993. So cool. And so having something that'll motivate you for something you already want is another great way of kind of bringing people forward and bringing people with you. And then we get to things that aren't necessarily problems, but more like opportunities. There's a ton of ways that people can self-directedly learn stuff, as I'm sure you know. Khan Academy, lynda.com, Universal Class. To my favorite local pastime, which I found out was the thing for one of my dudes at drop-in time, watching tractor engines run on YouTube. That's his thing, and now he loves the internet. Don't care, not judging. We watch tractor engines run together, and I'm just there with a big grin on my face because he didn't use a computer, and now he's stoked about them. So, you know, learning is kind of where things are going. I mean, how many other people here learned a thing by watching a YouTube video, right? Like, I learned to play ukulele. I learned how to fix my car's back seat. I learned how to do this to my hair on YouTube. And so this last part is what I sometimes call the last divide, that concept of digital readiness. I had to figure out something with my hair. I don't have any other long-haired friends. Internet's gonna solve my problem and be my long-haired friend, right? And it was, but I knew that and I was comfortable with it and I could skip all the other garbage and buy this and all this stuff to find some other ladies who were like, oh, I just do this thing. And I'm like, oh, that's so nice. But that concept of digital readiness with more and more learning opportunities shifting online, we need to understand what's involved, right? So it's not just, I can't use a mouse, though there is that, or my vision isn't great, though there is that, or I'm not a good reader, though there is that. And those are all sort of usability things we can take into account. But there's the trust issue, which was fascinating to me sitting in on the blockchain thing. Like, here's a future where you don't have to trust anybody ever. And that has value for what it's trying to do. But part of what we need to do is sort of cultivate and curate trust in some of these tools, which is why sometimes I'm very careful when I talk about the blockchain with my digitally divided users, because it's like, okay, later you're never gonna trust anybody and your computer's just gonna do pure math to take care of your things. But for now, you've gotta trust me and YouTube to try and figure out how we're gonna fix your lawnmower, because that's probably where the answer is. We don't have lawnmower fixing books in the library anymore, or maybe we do, we probably do. But in the future, probably you're gonna be learning like this. So let's talk about what's necessary to help you solve this problem for you. And, you know, they need to trust themselves, they need to trust the tools, they need to be discerning to tell the difference between what's a good YouTube video on actual lawnmower repair and what's somebody trying to sell you lawnmower, I don't know where this sentence is going, trying to sell you something. And this is tricky in an era of serious bullshit, which is what I call the current era that we are involved in. And it's no wonder that people have trouble figuring out what to trust and how to trust. So my job as a librarian in 2018 is to help you be digitally ready or help other people to help you be digitally ready, which involves this trust thing almost as much as it involves this mouse thing. And so helping people trust and teaching them to trust in their own skills. And if you want to go read this, it's linked in the list of links. And their ability to discern what's real from what's not real, the credible from the fraudulent. The big thing I've been talking about, so like Facebook, oh my God, they're nonsense. But like that lady who got run over by the Uber car, right? And her human safety driver. And depending which article you read, you might think, and you might think this was true, like that she walked out in front of the car, or if you read a different article, you might think that she was in the bike lane, and you might not, I mean, I would, but I don't know about other people, be confident in your ability to figure out which of those articles was telling the truth. Now, we're living in the panopticon, and so we can watch a video now of where that woman was on her bicycle, which I don't want to watch because, but otherwise it was just people fighting and you needing to figure out who to trust, and the outcome of how you feel about that story is dramatically different depending on whose version of it you believe, which is, to me, what the fake news thing is about. I mean, manipulating elections is terrible, but manipulating people's feelings about technology so that they'll make different choices about how they make laws that govern themselves is actually kind of a bigger deal in some ways. And so, you know, that's the next stage of the digital divide, is teaching people how to figure out a thing that they care about. Like, well, what was the story with that Uber running the lady over story? And not what the people who are pushing the agenda want you to, like, well, she had kids when she was 15. Well, who gives a shit, right? Like, but depending which stories you read, they're going to sort of amplify certain parts of the message and minimize others. You know, the New York Times called the person behind the wheel like a human safety driver, which is kind of a weird turn of phrase because that person is not the driver, or the driver, in which case they're not the human safety driver, they're just the driver. But sort of enough on this topic, but it was interesting for me to analyze what I knew about that and how I knew what I knew epistemologically and how I felt like a neighbor or a friend would or would not be able to do that thing. Because I can only talk to so many people and crab about it on Twitter, but everybody's responsibility is to make sure people have good information, and yet so much of it is technologically mediated. That becomes complicated, right? And people's trust is shaky as it is because the troubles. And the good news is people who are going to the library are people who are already primed to use the internet for learning. We can use the platform to help people learn to trust things by showing them trustworthy stuff that exists over time, and what not to trust, maybe, useful, tough sometimes. I mean, like I said, a third of my neighbors are sort of Trump supporters, and trying to figure out how to get messages across to them about where to get good news is challenging because, again, they have a kind of a light is better over here attitude about certain things. Not that I don't, but having a conversation with them is very different than sort of my left wing watches Amy Goodman all the time, has strong feelings about stuff landlady. You know, the message is different. And because the message is different, the message doesn't scale the same way it would if you could just roll out a thing and if we all agreed from first principles what was true and how we understood truth. And so one of the other things research points to us about digital readiness and uptake, and this is true for climbing out of a number of social problems generally, not just sort of internet access, people who are just out of prison, domestic violence victims, people who have sort of survived trauma generally, is that the more supportive their entire network of people is, the better their ability to get out of a bad situation, whether that bad situation is your digital divide, your bad situation is, you know, you're on parole and you want to be able to reincorporate with your community, your bad situation is your bad relationship, maybe with your bad president. And the lack of broadband and connectivity is not necessarily a bad situation the way intractable social problem issues are. I have a sort of a running Google search for digital divide, and one of the things that I find is we get a lot of stories about you know, indigenous kids who sit outside the library to be able to do their homework because they don't have internet where they live. And I like those stories because I think they highlight the problem, but I don't like those stories because I think they also offer a really easy solution, which is like, oh, give the kid internet at home and that kid's gonna be exactly the same as a kid who's had internet at home since the kid was born. And it's trickier than that, and I don't mean to be like, so don't try, but I do mean like, don't just offer sort of facile digital divide scenarios that are also happen to be the ones that you can help, basically. So it's, you know, structural limitations on connectivity, but also inclusion and access that we have to be dealing with. So since, you know, the library stopped being a room full of books, though we're still that, we've moved more towards being conduits, I think, for different things. Electronic information, obviously, but also skill building. And community stewardship, how to nurture and take care of your community. We're actually becoming the group that kind of shows you how to do that, especially in the United States, as more groups are more like, just our community, you know, depending where you are, obviously. And now we're into the more nebulous role of, among other things, and I find this weird to say, but like incentivizing participation. So it's not just that we are trying to sort of tell people here it is. We want to actually bring people where we are. We want to calm their fears. We want to become the trusted source and ally among a ton of people who are just trying to sell you something. And so it's not, and this is my favorite Creative Commons picture of all these, so it's not just give a person a fish, obviously, though that's part of it, because you can't do it without tech and broadband. And it's not teach a person to fish, though that's part of it, because you have to practice and you need the skills. It's helping someone not be afraid of the water. And it's showing them a good spot where the fish are actually biting. It's guiding them through their first few fishing trips, maybe asking them how it went afterwards in a way that indicates you actually care about their thing. And that's what digital readiness as an approach to this is actually about. I think there's a lot of beauty in technology myself. I mean, I love it. I love to hang out with it. I love to play with it, not just in a, oh, chips are sexy kind of way, but in the way it can bring us together and help us learn and help us become who we want to be. So as I said earlier, it's not just hold the mouse like this anymore. Those messages have been in the ether since we've had mice, which is 1984. They're important, but they're not enough. We not only give people access to the information that they want and need, but we also improve and strengthen their own access to their own communities, and that's what helps improve digital readiness and help people become more like themselves. Even my neighbors who didn't vote like I voted have a right to become the way they want to be for themselves. The digital divide hurts everyone. Libraries help ease the digital divide. Libraries help everyone. So let's go learn more ways to do more things with tech to help more people. Thank you.